Chapter 19. Maxwell propped his chin on his fist and looked at his brother with mild disapproval as he waited for him to make his next move. Chess had always been a favorite pastime of the mayor's, except when he played against his brother. Fenton was an absolute tortoise when it came to his turn. The mayor often utilized the lengthy amount of time to plot his subsequent stratagem by analyzing the various moves his brother could maneuver. However, Fenton usually took so long to make his next move that Maxwell frequently forgot his plans and ended up losing out of sheer boredom. The mayor was fairly certain this was his elder brother's intention, and so comforted himself with the knowledge that he was the better chess player, because his brother resorted to devious means in order to win. Maxwell sighed loudly, causing Fenton to glance up at him and smirk roguishly. "Patience is a virtue, my dear brother," he critiqued. Maxwell bared his teeth in what Fenton thought was supposed to be a smile. "You know, Fenton, I think you would find a timed game challenging enough, even for your formidable skills. Perhaps we should play a timed game." Fenton slid a pawn forward and leaned back in his chair. "Perhaps." Maxwell retaliated instantly by capturing the pawn with his knight. Observing the move, Fenton surveyed the chessboard. "Maxwell," he smiled wickedly, "it is just like you to forget that a pawn, if properly used, can win the game." He moved his queen into a highly coveted position which was previously unattainable due to the threat the knight had posed, and said triumphantly, "Checkmate." Maxwell sneered, knocking his king over with a careless gesture. "Tomorrow we shall try a timed game and see how much your pawns help you then." The clock struck midnight, and as if on cue, the front door burst open, and seconds later Amelia Stanton entered the living room. "Good evening, gentlemen," she greeted. Deputy Howard sauntered in behind her, removed his hat, and enjoyed the bewildered looks of both the mayor and his brother. Fenton stood up and smiled graciously. "Dearest, we did not expect you back so soon." Amelia lifted her cheek for him to kiss, and then sat down. "I felt that my brother would be slightly suspicious of my arrival after his tussle with Maxwell, so I made sure I had the wonderful deputy here in on the plan. I wanted backup if there was any trouble, which there was." Fenton lifted an eyebrow. "Trouble? Of what sort?" "Paxton knew everything." "He knew everything, eh?" Maxwell stood up and walked over to the window. "How is that possible?" Amelia put a graceful hand to her heart. Well, obviously, my dear brother-in-law, you have a snitch in your operation. Maxwell fingered his chin in contemplation. Deputy Howard, while looking at Amelia, piped up, "True enough, Mr. Mayor. Mrs. Fenton here met me at my office, and told me of your plan to cause trouble between Paxton Reign and his missus. And just so's you know, I think having Mrs. Stanton pretend Mr. Stanton here was going to try and bump her off was a brilliant plan. Anyways, Amelia asked me to come along and keep an eye out. I heard everything." In his rough Western accent, Howard reiterated what had happened in the Reigns' home between Amelia, her brother, and Elizabeth, from start to finish. "Mrs. Stanton tried to get some sympathy by crying, but Paxton just ignored her and done pulled Elizabeth away into another room. I heard his voice coming from an open window. Since Mrs. Fenton were indisposed, I reckoned I'd go over to the bedroom window and listen in. Paxton didn't say who the spy was, though. Rather hazy on that point. He did tell this big old tale about his past with your brother and Mrs. Amelia. Said he wouldn't trust her again, no way, no how. All's I can say, fellas, is that Mrs. Amelia done the best she could. She sure didn't have much of a chance against the likes of Paxton Reign. That fellow's more cunning than a wily old fox." Amelia smiled kindly at the deputy as he finished his report. Her face began to shine with a victorious countenance as she dipped a dainty hand into her small floral valise and puttered around. "I did manage to get the coveted item, though." Fenton's expression brightened with anticipation. "You located the jar of cocoa, then?" "Yes. It wasn't hidden. I found it in her cupboard." She lifted the container labeled Star Cocoa out of her handbag and placed it carefully on the coffee table. "I hope it's something to help our cause," Maxwell said, eyeing the labeled jar skeptically. "It's what Elizabeth went to the house for," Fenton interjected, "at least according to her own words. I thought it suspicious that she'd take the trouble of returning to the ranch, daring the odds of running into you, just for a jar of cocoa. I opened the jar then and there, but it yielded nothing but cocoa, and very good cocoa at that. I dismissed her. But as I watched her leave, I started feeling as though I should have inspected the jar further." Amelia breathed out a sigh. "Well, now you can, Fenton." Fenton suppressed a childish grin and twisted the lid from the jar. Maxwell barked an order for Alistair to fetch an empty jar from the pantry. Carefully emptying the chocolate powder into the other glass jar, Amelia held her breath as Fenton examined the Star Cocoa jar closely. After a brief moment, his face fell, and he distastefully handed the jar to his wife. "Nothing," he shrugged. "Either it truly was cocoa, or Elizabeth has already taken whatever else it contained." "Maybe we should sift the cocoa," Deputy Howard suggested. "No," Fenton mused, taking the jar again. Elizabeth's had it for a while, and probably looted it already. For all we know, it might not even be the right jar." Amelia said it wasn't hidden, and star cocoa is common enough. "Though this is an old label," he conceded, staring at the jar ponderously. His hands rotated it round and round, and then he placed the scrutinized object on the table begrudgingly. He put his arm around Amelia's waist. "Don't blame yourself, my dear. You did the best you could. The fault is mine." Inwardly he cursed himself for allowing Elizabeth's beauty to dull his wits that day at the ranch. "I should have confiscated the container the instant I saw it." "No matter," Maxwell responded to his brother's self-criticism with a slight grin. "I'm sure the contents of that jar, if they were anything other than cocoa, would have meant little to us anyhow." Fenton eyed him pessimistically. "Are you? Are you really?" The younger Stanton stood up, yawned, and stretched. "Indeed I am, brother." What could a jar of cocoa hold, anyways? A note? A key? Even dissecting the jar. He put special emphasis on the word dissecting. Before the lovely Elizabeth would have exposed nothing of any real consequence, I'm sure. "Amelia, I appreciate your efforts on my behalf, but—" Amelia's interrupting titter held no mirth. "Deputy Howard, I appreciate your assistance this evening. I'm truly sorry I couldn't offer you something a little juicier at the end of our tiny intrigue." She tilted her head slightly and exhaled delicately. "Please be assured I didn't mean to waste your valuable time." Recognizing the obvious dismissal, the deputy placed his hat back on his head and tipped it in her direction. "Helping you weren't no waste, ma'am." He expressed his farewells to the others and sauntered off. After Howard had left, Amelia addressed her brother-in-law gravely. "Maxwell, I don't think you understand that neither our ingenuity nor our resourcefulness can solve your problem." "Amelia," Fenton began. "My brother, Paxton, is a cunning man in his own right, and his guard is up," she continued, ignoring her husband. "Whether through a spy or his own deduction, he figured out my entire plan the moment I arrived at his ranch. You've exhausted all of your designs, and your attempts to woo Elizabeth are utterly futile because she absolutely loathes you. She's no fool, though she may be more naive than my brother. It was obvious to me upon meeting her that not only is she beautiful, she is a determined and intelligent girl. Your chance of winning her is about as likely as your chance of raising someone from the dead. Might I suggest that you find another preoccupation?" Fenton shifted uneasily in his chair, and Maxwell stared at her in awkward silence. "Perhaps an unmarried woman, with less ability to reason and think for herself? There are plenty around here, surely." Maxwell raked his fingers through his dark hair and balled them into fists. His knuckles turned white, and the hair between his fingers went taut. His countenance took on the look of a maniac as he mused aloud. "You are right, of course. I should have admitted defeat long before this. I cannot make Elizabeth Dalton, Reign, fall in love with me. I can't make her marry me. But maybe I don't need to do either." Amelia squeezed her slender hands together tightly. "I do hope, Maxwell, that you aren't considering what I think you're considering, because there's no way I will stand by and allow that to happen." Maxwell removed a cigar from his jacket pocket, offered one to his brother, lit both of them, and looked at his sister-in-law reproachfully. "I would not even consider murdering Elizabeth, Amelia." "That's not quite what I was referring to, and you are certainly aware of that." Cold, icy contempt dripped on every syllable she articulated. "I will not be privy to the ravishing or physical harm of Elizabeth Reign." Fenton, who'd been listening to the discourse with some intensity, cut in. "Quite right. Rape is a dreadful business. I will have no part of it." He patted his brother's shoulder condescendingly. "It is beneath us Stantons to even think of such a thing." Maxwell collapsed into the first available chair, and sulked conspicuously. "I would never have thought of raping the lovely Elizabeth, or any other girl, for that matter. I'm not that evil." He glared at the two of them accusingly. "I'm absolutely astounded you two would even believe I could concoct such a horrendous plan. I was merely considering banishing them from my town, so I can stop thinking about her. If she's entirely out of my reach, in more ways than one, it'd be easier to move on, and besides, if I succeed in exiling them, I won't have to feel totally conquered." "You could order the bank to foreclose on their mortgage," Amelia suggested. Maxwell waved his hand at her impatiently. "I've already thought of that. The Reigns bought their land outright. They have no mortgage to foreclose." "Well, you are mayor. Can't you just ask them to leave?" Alistair, whom no one knew had been listening, broke his silent vigil. Maxwell chuckled. "You would think so, wouldn't you? However, in this town, Paxton has about as much, if not more, respect and admiration as I do. I'd need a very good and convincing reason to force them to leave. And, judging by his reactions to our schemes thus far, I highly doubt he'd leave his ranch just because I asked him to." A slight hum escaped his lips as he mused. I definitely have to have a very good reason to banish them." Consciously and carefully, Maxwell placed each chess piece back in its original position on the board. "So, it's back to the beginning again, but with a different end in mind. I'll not have Elizabeth as my wife, and her wretched husband dead, but both of them exiled, preferably to some awful wasteland, a wasteland with crocodiles, mosquito-infested swamps, a scorching temperature, and natives willing to shoot them at first glimpse. Yes, he pondered aloud, a land in which they can barely survive. And then, perhaps, she will abandon him and come crawling back to me.
I highly doubt that,
Amelia interrupted his delusions matter-of-factly. Fenton toyed absent-mindedly with his pocket-watch. You can hardly control where you expel them to, even if you should succeed in doing so. Maxwell expelled an aggravated groan, clearing the chessboard with one sweep of his arm. The wooden pieces clattered to the floor and rolled to obscure places of the room. I know that, you fools! Can't you just let me have one moment? Leave me, he commanded tersely. You're all useless. He waited with a contemptuous expression until his order was obeyed, and then his entire body sagged with total dejection. Making sure all the living-room lights were extinguished, Maxwell closed the etched glass doors behind him and entered the parlor. He went directly to the bar and poured himself a large glass of whiskey and downed it quickly. His body shuddered slightly as the drink hit him. He slumped against the bar, his head resting on his hand. His mind reeled with the evening's events and what they meant. He wondered if he'd missed anything. Was there really a snitch? If so, who was it? Did Amelia really hate Fenton, as she'd previously declared, or was this just one of his brother's sick games? Maxwell knew Fenton always set up some sort of plot of his own, a type of insurance policy, but with his head swimming and his senses dulling, due to the combination of exhaustion and alcohol, the mayor couldn't fathom a single conspiracy. He gulped another glass of whiskey and stared at his reflection in the parlor window. Alistair had obviously neglected to draw the curtains. Maxwell blinked in hopes of clearing his blurred vision. Age must be a factor. He was even more certain of it as he looked at his mirrored image. He was too old for these games. His senses were not as keen as they once were. With yet another sip, this time from the bottle, Maxwell sulkily acknowledged that even his brother was too old for these games, and that was the reason all their plotting had come to naught. The mayor briefly contemplated retirement, not only from his political position, but from his conniving as well. These thoughts left him petrified, and totally unsure of what he would do next. What a tragic story his life was turning out to be. Musing over his life, facing himself, figuratively and literally, was something Maxwell had never done before, at least not without a specific directive in mind. He shuddered again, but this time it was not because of the strength of his whiskey.
So pensive, Maxwell. I hope you're not feeling sorry for yourself.
Amelia's voice was soft and yet strangely sharp. He chuckled to himself, swirling his fingertip along the edge of his empty glass. "Not at all, I assure you." Maxwell turned to face her, and his heart began to pound at the sight. She stood in the entranceway of the parlor, in her robe. Beneath the sheer fabric of the robe, just barely visible, was a long satin nightdress. She was by no means indecent, but there was something deeply seductive about the way the pearl-white satin caressed her skin and outlined her curves. "Having a hard time getting to sleep?" he asked, trying to remain nonchalant. "Would you like to join me for a drink?" Guardedly, she entered the parlor, and a line from an old poem about a spider luring a fly into his web sprung to his mind. "Will you walk into my parlor?" said a spider to a fly. He intoned under his breath, only he was not quite certain just who was the fly and who was the spider. "Pardon me?" She glanced at him inquisitively as she seated herself beside him at the bar. "Whiskey?" He sidetracked her with the bottle. She nodded, and he graciously poured her a glass, and watched as she drank it. She gazed up at him with alluring blue eyes that hypnotized him. He was entirely unconscious of how close he had leaned in toward her. "What were you thinking so seriously about before I disturbed you?" Amelia turned away from him and smiled peculiarly. Maxwell, realizing with horror that his lips had scarcely avoided kissing his sister-in-law's, immediately began to examine his glass with false intensity. "Please don't refer to yourself as a disruption," he murmured, and then topped up their tumblers. "Nothing of any particular interest to you, I'm sure." "You appeared so contemplative," she coaxed. "I was merely pondering my life thus far." His response made him feel vulnerable. "Indeed?" Amelia's voice audibly perked up with avid curiosity. "No doubt a consequence of the day's revelations. What conclusion did you arrive at? Or did I interrupt you before you had come to one?" "My infatuation with Elizabeth is over. I do not wish to have anything more to do with the Reigns. My entire obsession was utterly childish, not to mention foolish. You alerted me to that." He smiled sadly at her. "I've no desire to conceal that I've been, and probably always will be, a devious man. Admittedly, I have manipulated, bullied, threatened, and even injured to get my way, but I've never committed murder." Amelia decided against enlightening him as to Elizabeth's thoughts on that point. "At this moment, I'm mortified to think I almost caused the death. Murdered an innocent man." He downed another tumblerful. "And because of a woman. Everything I've done lately is because of a woman. I've neglected my business and political affairs disgracefully. My father would be ashamed of me. I am ashamed of me. No doubt my brother is entertained by my stupidity." He shook his head ruefully
Believe me, Maxwell, you aren't the first man to do outrageous things because of a woman, and you most certainly won't be the last," Amelia declared soothingly.
Chuckling to himself, he lamented, "Look at me, sharing my feelings with a woman." There was a brief silence, while Maxwell looked at her meaningfully, and then the atmosphere became very charged. "But not just any woman. To the woman who forced me to open my power-hungry eyes and see the shocking reality of what a disgusting soul I am. Amelia, you have liberated me."
Edging away and feeling somewhat uncomfortable, she laughed. "Maxwell, you've had too much to drink." He seized her shoulders dramatically and turned her to face him.
"That only unshackles my true feelings and conquers my inability to express them. Come to complete your plan, Amelia."
Amelia gasped at the unexpected question coming from a voice other than Maxwell's.
She quickly removed herself from the latter's grip, which had slackened at the sound of the voice.
"I don't know what you're talking about, Fenton,"
she said acidly, redirecting her slight frame to face the entrance where he stood, leaning against the doorway. Hands in pockets, Fenton sauntered over to the bar. "My dear girl, you know exactly what I'm talking about."
Maxwell's explosive guffaw shattered the awkward silence and caused his sibling and sister-in-law to stare at him questioningly.
The entire intrigue had just come springing to his intoxicated mind as if he'd known about it all along. In his drunken state, he could not quite figure out how he'd subconsciously dissected the plan, or where the evidence was. Foggily, he reasoned he was able to put the pieces together because he was drunk. Enraged at having been so foolishly and obviously duped, Maxwell decided to approach his accusations with a less orthodox method. "Fenton, if you are referring to Amelia's design to seduce me, thereby executing her dual purpose of exacting revenge on you and distracting me from her brother's wife, well, I don't think such a plan ever inhabited Amelia's mind. Such a devious, perverted, yet extraordinarily adroit plot couldn't have come from a mere woman. Besides, Amelia's conscience would not allow her to carry out such a plan. She loves you too much to sleep with your brother."
Moments after his rather indecipherable speech, Amelia's exquisite mouth dropped open in astonishment. "Is that what you thought I was doing?"
she protested feebly. Maxwell smirked drunkenly. Furthermore, Amelia would most vehemently deny her resolute declarations of hatred toward her brother have altered somewhat of late, or were in fact falsified from the very beginning. Recently uncovered feelings of deep admiration and love for her brother are absolutely out of the question. It's highly unlikely Amelia subconsciously felt any guilt about the past and the way she treated a brother who she came to realize had only her best interests at heart. Amelia, desiring and succeeding to thwart my ambitions for Elizabeth? Incomprehensible. Inwardly, she must have known better than to allow herself to be torn between her husband and her estranged brother. Maxwell paused for effect and to pour Fenton a glass of whiskey. Have this. You need it. Amelia would never have purposefully rebelled against both of our wishes. No, the very idea of Amelia thinking and feeling this way is virtually impossible. Truly, brother, I'd be shocked to discover Amelia deliberately forewarned her brother of our plans and deluded our dear deputy into being her witness of sincerity. She certainly isn't capable of using her talents to inspire trust for her own ends, and with intent to betray. Our snitch, Fenton, is most definitely not your beautiful and reliable wife. Is that the plan to which you were referring, Fenton? Fenton sighed loudly. Maxwell, you were never any good at making elaborate, dramatic, or comprehensible accusations when you've had too much to drink. Let me see if I've got this right. Fenton took his hands out of his pockets, and with a look of complete detachment began to translate his brother's entire speech. You believe Amelia has secretly hated me all of these years, and feels guilty for past actions against her brother Paxton, which, according to you, she feels were facilitated by me. So, she orchestrated a complicated design to spoil our plans, help her brother, and cause an even larger rift between us by seducing you, correct? Maxwell took another gulp of his drink and nodded. Well, isn't that what you are accusing her of also? No. Actually, I was referring to Amelia having surreptitiously concealed a bottle of gin from your bar on her way to bed this evening. He displayed a small bottle in the pocket of his robe. As he continued, it was apparent that Maxwell's verbosity had rubbed off on him. I caught her attempting to drink away her sorrow. I can only surmise her distress is a result of having botched her task to aid us, and to dupe her brother. Failing, left her with a bitter taste in her mouth, a taste she desired to drown with gin. Since I do not approve of heavy drinking, on any occasion, I confiscated the bottle and ordered her to bed. I fell asleep, but awoke later to find her gone. I immediately supposed she disobeyed me and came downstairs to complete her plan of getting inebriated. Amelia giggled nervously, and then batted her eyelashes bewitchingly at her companions. Of that, I admit I am culpable. She seized the bottle from the mayor's hand and took a swig, despite her husband's look of disapproval. I'm simply guilty of being unable to sleep and craving some comfort. My, but don't you two talk strangely when drinking. I've had trouble keeping up with what either of you is saying. Maxwell sniggered callously. See, Fenton, a total innocent, without any cognizant intention of fully defying your instructions. She certainly is not a deceptive wife with her own agenda."
Maxwell, your imagination, as well as your language, are truly fascinating.
Amelia's voice was light and airy.
Your subtle accusation is preposterous, while being somewhat flattering. Your brother gives me too much credit, Fenton. Fancy that.
She purred as she slid the bottle of gin from his pocket.
Maxwell, do you really think so much of me, that I could concoct such a cunning and ingenious scheme, and confound not only one of you, but both of you?
She opened the bottle of gin and topped up all of their glasses with ease, and lifted her tumbler in a salute.
Fenton, one more drink won't do us any harm.
Fenton chuckled, conceding, and clinked his brother's glass enthusiastically. Maxwell refused to perform the gesture of a toast. "Yes, Max, be serious. Can you honestly picture Amelia being able to pull the wool over our eyes like that?" He guzzled his drink, unaware of the covert glare his wife was giving him. Neither Maxwell nor Fenton noted that she avoided her drink while they imbibed heavily on 2 or more glasses. Maxwell shrugged, feeling shaky in his resolve. Amelia appeared calm and unruffled by his allegations, and he'd failed to convince his brother of her guilt. Fenton was biased, probably blinded by his intimate relationship with the accused. Certainly, Amelia might be an excellent actress, but perhaps she was innocent. Maxwell's determination was wavering with every passing moment. The mayor was feeling increasingly tired and groggy, uncommonly groggy, as if he could simply lie down on the floor and pass out. He turned his glass upside down on the bar with a loud clank, and swayed a little when he slid off his bar stool. "Well, perhaps my imagination did run away with me tonight. My apologies, Amelia. Fenton, good night all," he managed, and lurched from the room without a backward glance.